This is Duke University.
Extending a hand, vital obsolescence and the non-human turn. A thought before the paper proper. In response to your call, I have written a thought piece. As such, the writing tracks thoughts that, like thought, do not always track in linear fashion, but overlap, change direction, cross paths, and tend toward general promiscuity. My hope, hopefully in league with the Humanities Center call, is not that one thought might align with another, for in that parallelism, nothing can amount to encounter. Rather, I hope that the thoughts collected here might swerve, bend, we could say dance. As in dance, thoughts in interaction might follow lead, or lead follow each other. Leading following, no space between, just leading following, is how Andre Lepecki describes Aaron Manning describing the complexities of intra-action in much dance practice, where followers, in fact, cue leaders, and a follower can be said, more often than not, to initiate. Responding to Manning, Andre Lepecki posits the undecidability of leading following as, quote, dancing in the interval, end quote. By dancing in the interval, Lepecki is leading following the thoughts of Jacques Rancière. The interval is dissensus. So the paper proper. I'm honored to have been the recipient of your invitation. I received an instruction. Contribute an original thought piece that should address what you consider to be a vital area of contemporary research in your field, including reflections on its significance for the future of the discipline within which the field is located. The broader FHI project description in which this call is nested suggests that a seismic paradigm shift is underway, such that, quote, long-standing humanities disciplines may be becoming interdisciplines, and as such, the question of the, quote, future of the field within which the field is located, end quote, may be itself obsolescence. I admit to being very interested in obsolescence as a state of becoming that we should perhaps engage if we are to engage politically. This is in part because, as Rancière writes, politics is, quote, always of the moment, and its subjects are always precarious. A political difference is always on the shore of its own disappearance, end quote. This is so because, unlike policing, the aim of politics is to, quote, invent new ways of making sense of the sensible, in short, new bodily capacities, end quote. That's Rancière. This is why politics emerges as always already choreographic activity, and there I'm quoting Lepecki again. But my interest in obsolescence as vital may also be due to my own disciplinary background in theater, which is a live art form famously and rightly hailed as dead again and again and again. As I wrote in a TDR issue I co-edited on performance and precarity, live theater has long imagined itself to be dead. Cinema was said to have killed it again after a precedent slaying by photography. Its modern visionaries of note, Zola, Stanislavski, Artaud, constantly decried the habit of theater's own conventions to strangle itself from within. Theater, it appears, has long been its own voracious parasite and the source of its own perpetual ruin. Any artwork that traffics in theater or the theatrical, which is not the same as performance or the performative, can be ruined by that traffic, or worse, by some accounts, can be traffic in ruin. And yet, I wrote, theater persists. More, it thrives at the threshold of obsolescence. It feeds on some kind of undecidable passageway between the live and the dead. And though, unlike dissensus, which is to say politics, it may require its own ephemerality, it is always, quote, on the shore of its own disappearance, or, as Herbert Blau has written of theater, it's there when we look again. So we can track a persistent investment in theater's ruin value running through philosophy, the arts, and the letters. It's the obsolete that recurs, not so much to challenge or to battle obsolescence, but to champion it, and I would argue to trouble our ready categories, whatever they may be, of subject/object, human/non-human, live/dead. Not getting rid of these oppositions, but gesturing to the zone in which they become indistinguishable. Appearing as already dead, the live of theater is one you just can't kill. And as the god of theater, Dionysius, says in the fullness of his half-human vitality to the empire builder Pentheus in the Bacchae, quote, "The god you call dead is Dionysius," end quote. Though Hart and Negri celebrated Dionysius as the joyful god of living labor in their first book, reserving him for something of a neo-vitalism, the god is also, we might recall, the seriously grumpy, twice-born, undead gender trouble effigy of the mask, who interrupts our habits of legislating precise lines between decrescence and emergence, between bios and necros. The actor, as intra-dead or intra-live, or extra dead or extra live, reminds us paradoxically that dead labor lives, or said another way, that depreciation, unproductivity, decrescence in all its theatricalities is not merely animate nor definitively inanimate, but complexly intra-inanimate. Like Dionysus, human and non. So you have asked that I address what I understand to be a vital area of contemporary research in my field. Having just remarked on the living dead theater, it may be puzzling that I choose to explicitly point to the word vital, from the Latin vita or life and noting an animating principle, that I choose to point to this word by placing it in quotation marks. I do this as a means to acknowledge the word as hailing, in fact, from you. It is your word. I cite it only to return it to you, but to note its travels, to mark its having been exchanged between us, and to say that the question of the vital or the neo-vital is what I take to be a vital area of contemporary research. Punctuated, the word vital carries a cross-temporal indication that we will have exchanged something here. Marks of reiteration at vital return the word to you and indicate its historical drag and signal the cross-temporal dynamics, which may not only be vitality, but may be the inertia of the élan vital. That's a quote from Roger Caillois in response. Marcel Mauss was right to note, gestures are techniques of the body that are, as Carrie Noland underscores, first and foremost iterable techniques. And techniques of iteration are techniques of passing, techniques that are of, at, in, or always as an interval. The mode of passage can vary, body to body, hand to word, to mouth, to hand, to word, to mouth, to word, to body. Call and response might include intemporal ricochet, you, me, and the multitudinous third person, who Roberto Esposito terms the non-person, and who might be Agamben's whatever being, animal, vegetable, mineral, human, and non. Vital is nothing if not on the move, and gesture, as Deborah Caption has written of practices of possession trance, is a medium, like quotation marks, of transit. Caption writes, channeling Henri Lefebvre, quote, "Gestures of transit are gestures that bring the subject from one realm of subjective experience to another. In Henri Lefebvre's words, these gestures, quote, this is still caption, okay, I'm quoting within quoting. In Henri Lefebvre's words, these gestures, quote, allow passage from one code or subcode to another, interrupting the one so as to open the way to the other, end quote, end quote. Fascinating for this essay, a primary gesture for the mode of transit that is possession trance is, quote, extending the limbs forcibly out, end quote. Caption also reminds us, again with Lafave as her guide, that it is through gestures that, quote, ideology escapes from pure abstraction and performs actions, end quote. Of course, this rings true as well with Althusser, who lifts words from or places them in the policeman's mouth. Hey, you there, and says the policeman on order from Althusser in his little theater of interpolation. The call of the policeman to dissent or not to dissent is gestural, like a hand, extended in greeting or halting or otherwise hailing. But as a gesture, which is to say, as a means of transit, relation is inaugurated, but not determined, right? Response hangs in an undecided abeyance of relation. A gesture of hail, and perhaps any gesture, both inaugurates and casts relation into the undecidability of an interval at the threshold of response, leading, following, or dancing in the interval. A gesture is intraactive activity itself and will be co-constituted on the grounds of encounter, open necessarily to dissensus, which is to say politics. We may say then that performative words or phrases are by extension gestures, and thus by extension modes of transit, and also by extension material. The key term here is extension. And though it flips us onto the shores of incomprehension, let's see what happens if we say this. Citation may be linked in curious ways to the extended limbs of the possessed or otherwise occupied dancer, whose limbs, when possessed, are never entirely singular to the dancer, but co-constituted by the agents of possession, who, singular plural, may be said to be leading, following in an interval, conjuring, why not, the continually recurrent potential in dissensus. You will already have noticed I am purposefully confusing language and gesture, embodiment and discursivity, hands and words. I am kneading them or circling them or dancing them or leading, following them into realms of mutual material mimesis that, like the ecstatic trance of the Maenads, is not the same as representation. I am taking a number of cues in doing this. I am purposefully inter-inanimating, and inter-inanimating is a word I used in performing remains. And here I've changed it to intra-inanimating. Taking a cue from the feminist science studies scholar Karen Barad in her widely read Post-Humanist Performativity Toward an Understanding of How Matter Comes to Matter. She has termed this the material discursive. And as many in the so-called new materialist turn argue, we need to have done with what some see as the humanities' disciplinary orientations to discourse as primarily linguistic and to human as human alone. They argue quite passionately that the domain of discourse and the agency of the subject formerly known as singularly human should be expanded to a co-constitutional field, a commons of matter with matter, in which agency is distributed and in which words and things and words as things as words, and all of them, human and non-human, are intra-agentic. We make each other as each other. And in a longer version of this paper, I take up Roger Calwa on the mimesis between stick insects and sticks, or animals and environment. While the shorthand critique of this move, new materialist move to agentic matter, might run as the exculpatory and offensive phrase, the gas chamber made me do it, a shorthand retort could be, yes, it did. What we make makes us. What makes us, we also make. If we make violence, through that violence we are made. In an inter-inanimated world in which minerals in geologic time are as vital as animals and vegetables, everything gestures, everything is possessed of bodily technique, to quote from Mauss again. Everything performs, is vulnerable, and intra-related. Intra-related, we found each other, human, non-human, and complex intra-inanimations of both. Lest this sound overly romantic, recall that Mel Chen has recently written brilliantly about bodily living with mercury poisoning and mercury living with him. Intimacies that are queer, he writes, if also toxic. And surely we can readily accede to our own pharmaceutically biocapitalized bodies as, let's face it, not only genetically modified, but, as Melinda Cooper has put it, quote, literally annexed within capitalist processes of accumulation, end quote. That is, complexly intrarelated and prosthetically extended, we are networked, not only across material and across species, but now imbricated in an affective neoliberal economy of interinanimated necros and bios that do not spell out some sort of molecular hallmark card translating to relational means loving. Co-founding and confounding each other, we are, as Judith Butler writes, quote, undone by each other. And she writes this writing of ecstasy, not necessarily Dionysian ecstasy, but she writes that we are undone by each other, writing of ecstasy as well as trauma. For her, the relational each other does not describe a space between autonomous entities, right? But is always marked by a rupture, a cut that constitutes identity as relation. The ecstatic, or states in which we are literally beside ourselves, such as grief or joy or political rage, opens us to access dispossessions by which we are never only one and perhaps never only human. So in 2013, I made a trip to witness firsthand negative handprints in the prehistoric caves of France. I wanted to ask about the hand as hail and to think about the duration of gesture and the intervals between gestures' reiterations. If gestures are primarily iterable techniques, then how could one iteration, my hand say, raised in hail, be understood in total temporal isolation from subsequent or previous iterations of a hand raised in hail? Iterations, after all, require intervals. Iterations necessarily jumping time, space, and bodies to become themselves as gestures in reiteration. Heading to France, I wondered, if I meet a Paleolithic hand, a first hand, right, with a second hand, my own, meeting that first hand, what would become of first and second? Standing in the cave, why would I be more live or more vital in responding to or even recognizing the Paleolithic hand than the first hand was, is, or continues to be in making the hail? Which hand makes the hail a hail? That is, even if the cave hand wasn't originally a hail, does it become one, even illegitimately, by virtue of response? Or does it become backward a response by virtue of a hail? If I fundamentally recognize the Paleolithic hand because I also have one, and recognize the gesture of the upheld palm because I also make one or might make one, does liveness as a matter of exchange exist only as intervallic reiteration, which is neither sameness nor difference, but both? Is there then a time limit on the interval or a time limit on liveness? Is there a statute of limitations on responsibility? It may be too easy to think of these teasing questions with human hands, which conveniently come to us as inversions of one another, even if here over 40,000 years. Might we excise the human from the hail entirely and ask whether the rock face itself, regardless of the anthropomorphic trace of the human, might be approached as performing a hail, moving in deep time with a gesture of its own, cast to its own and its others? The hail is interestingly what W.J.T. Mitchell implicitly gives to any and all images and objects in his book, What Do Pictures Want? And what Robin Bernstein in Dances with Things registers explicitly and simply as things hail. And I like the notion of the hail or the gestural call because it preserves a temporal interval, a space for, I did write a space for difference, but I think I now have to say a space for indifference. Or as Bergson would have it, for intervals, as Bergson would have it for intervals, right? Radical heterogeneity, which now I have to rethink, which is perhaps, I'll just rethink it as indifference to difference. in other words, it reserves a space for heterogeneity within the otherwise homogenizing vibrancy of everything. And I use that word vibrancy. That's Jane Bennett's favorite word. But I'm concerned, I'm very concerned about the temporal interval because I worry about a tendency to ahistoricity in the new materialist turn, a potential essentialism or an essentializing of potential, a universalizing, if not an anthropomorphizing, and if not an anthropomorphizing, then a molecularizing that can rush in at the door of a generalized animacy. But if that is my concern, it's not the end of my interest, for it is also the case that the new materialist reenchantment of the world, neo-primitivist as that is, and here I just want to register how important it is and how much there is to say about neo-primitivism at this moment that this paper can't address. But if we have questions about that in terms of the neo-vitalism of the moment, maybe we can talk about it in question and answer period. But I think that my concerns about the potential sort of ahistoricity of the new materialist turn don't cancel some of the promise for me, because I think it affords an opportunity to critique our ongoing capitalist dispossessions. And after all, it was Marx who launched a passionate effort to take the fetish seriously. While in France, I also visited Lascaux II, a fabricated tourist cave built beside the original Paleolithic one. And what I noticed, the thing about being in that cave, and I'll just say it quickly, is that the fake cave had to be built. Why? Because, of course, the original cave, over the 70 years since it's been discovered, is being deteriorated by what? Human breath, CO2, all the things that liveness does to stone. And it flips our equation of the idea that the live is what's disappearing and that stone is some kind of remain and not vulnerable. And it invites all sorts of questions about the who's the first hand, actually. The live hand is in that way, in some senses, older in its continual kind of recurringness. So I want to close with two more images. In these pieces, Valley Export, this is from 1976 for Configuration, and the human form is citing architecture, and the architecture is citing the human form. And I'm really interested in these images because I feel, as I read them, interinanimation and intravulnerability seem to arise as much from stone as from flesh. The two are not only appear interinanimate, but are interinanimate, traveling across our space here now, together, as a photograph that enters your eyes and makes, like mercury in your blood, contact with you. As Calwa says of cross-species mimicry, and as Capshan writes of possession trance, quote, things that have once been in contact remain united, end quote. When I cited you at the top of this paper, for example, with the word vital, was I not invited by you in your call to so cite? Why would we not extend the invitation inherent in gestic citation to mattering generally? And that's my paper. Thank you.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.